Thank you, Miriam. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to the second day BAP's virtual workshop. And the first topic that we are going to talk about is the role of trade-based money laundering in illegal wildlife trafficking. So my name is Jialing Li. I am a senior manager in Deloitte US, focusing on the financial crime compliance. Same practice as Miriam. And today we are very honored to be joined by Billy Stahl from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And he's a special agent in charge specifically in the Office of Law Enforcement Investigations Unit. Billy, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience so everybody will get to know you?
Sure. Good morning, Jilene, and good morning, everybody. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
All right. My name is Billy Stahl. As Jilene said, I'm the special agent in charge of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Office of Law Enforcement Investigations Unit. And so that is a headquarters component for the primary law enforcement arm within DOI that addresses wildlife crime. And so my role within our agency is to provide overall programmatic support to our field special agents and wildlife inspectors, as well as policy development and external liaison. A little bit
Thank you,
about
Billy.
myself. This is coming up on my 17th year in law enforcement, which has a very, I guess, diverse stretch, if you will. After graduating from the University of Baltimore with a degree in forensics, I started at the Pentagon Force Protection Agency, where I was a uniformed police officer for 7 years, primarily on our tactical response team. I spent the next year and a half working criminal investigations and protective intelligence at the Pentagon, while also as a collateral providing some overseas protection with our undersecretaries of defense and the Secretary of Defense. I then spent the next 4 years with the Environmental Protection Agency's Criminal Investigation Division, working environmental criminal investigations out of the Mid-Atlantic area in the United States, until finally joining the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 2021 as part of the Special Investigations Unit, which at the time was the major crimes unit for OLE, working complex, often international criminal investigations involving wildlife crime and the illegal wildlife trade.
Thank you, Billy. And before we look at the screen, we are going to have some slides to share with you as Billy continues today's discussion. I just want to give everybody an overview of what we are going to cover today. Billy is going to discuss about what U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service do, as well as what the special focus areas of Office of Law Enforcement. We are going to talk about some interesting programs as well, such as the Forensic Lab and which covers also different animals like turtles, eagles, as well as Indian arts. And we'll wrap up today's discussion by discussing what private sectors, such as financial institutions, can support and assist in combating illegal wildlife trades and crimes. So, with the first topic coming up, first I'm going to share my screen. And Billy, I do have my first question for you. What is wildlife crime? And what does U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service do? Because people listening to the term, they may think I'm getting my fishing license. So, could you please give the audience a little bit of the context here while I pull up the slide?
Sure, absolutely. So wildlife crime, I think generally can refer to basically the exploitation of wild animals and plants to include poaching, trafficking, and the illegal trade of all wildlife, but more specifically, in terms of priorities like protected species and their products. Often these crimes are conducted for consumption purposes. The belief in their use in traditional medicine. Often they're status symbols or they're trending. They're desirable for people to possess, and so that's how they get into the trade, or they're trophies. And then the bottom line is at the end of the day, it's money. It's another way to profit off of an illegal activity. So. But oftentimes, and unbeknownst to a lot of the people that partake in this, these crimes threaten biodiversity of wild populations. They undermine conservation efforts of agencies like mine, and they're often linked to, and more now, broader transnational criminal elements as well. Um, in addition to wildlife crime, like I said, money is a big driver in the why for people getting involved in this. Financial crime is a critical part of these crimes, and specifically what we look into, especially wildlife trafficking. So again, it's profit driven. So compared to other major serious crimes like narcotics trafficking and guns trafficking, wildlife crime is less risk intensive, and not all the time, but oftentimes the penalties are less severe. So um, if you are already engaged in, criminal activity, there is some draw into, I guess, diversifying your portfolio and getting involved in that. Concerning my agency, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, generally, we're the primary federal agency in the United States with the Department of the Interior for, we're charged with, conservation of wildlife and wildlife species and enhancing those populations. Within that agency, within U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, is my law enforcement agency, which is the Office of Law Enforcement. And so we are the enforcement arm, as I said earlier, for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We're comprised of special agents, wildlife inspectors, intelligence analysts, scientists from our lab, and various other support staff. And we investigate any violation of federal wildlife laws. And we have some very, very useful tools that allow us to get into a broad array of investigations and enforcement work with our partners. Um, our wildlife inspectors at the port, which I'll get into later, they regulate the legal trade and also interdict the unlawful trade of wildlife species. And a lot of what we do is achieved, because we're relatively small, through continued collaboration and partnerships with not only other federal law enforcement agencies and state and foreign partners, but also non-governmental actors or parties, and then other sectors.
Thanks, Billy. I want to double click a little bit more into the Office of Law Enforcement, where your investigations units are residing. So, can you tell us a little bit more about the Office of Law Enforcement, especially the special agents? Additionally, recently when we discussed, you were mentioning that Office of Law Enforcement just went through a reorganization. So if you can tell us a little bit more about what is the purpose of that and what are the new strategies and focus areas of this reorganization, that will be very helpful as well.
Sure. Yeah, so as I mentioned, the Office of Law Enforcement, and I'll refer to that as OLE moving forward. It's just easier. As I mentioned, we're comprised of special agents, wildlife inspectors, and various support staff. So um, again, we are not only charged with investigating wildlife crime, but also just regulating the legal trade, and then educating and providing outreach to everyone globally. Um, our special agents, we've got, with retirements and whatnot, we have just under 200 spread out domestically and abroad. We do have, and I'll get into the unit later on, but we do have an international arm of agents that are tasked with providing capacity building and outreach to our foreign conservation law enforcement partners, and providing support to our domestic-based investigations. We have agents throughout all major cities and areas in the country, and typically they come from a diverse array of backgrounds, whether it's a prior stint with a state conservation law enforcement agency, whether it's from another federal law enforcement agency. We have some military personnel and the like. As Jilene said, we did go through a recent reorganization. Part of that was done out of necessity. I think with the way that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is structured, overall, there's a regional geographical based model, and some of that is based off of history, historical trends and needs, flyways for certain migratory birds and other purposes. And what we found with the Office of Law Enforcement is that that doesn't necessarily ring true for us, the need to be geographically based. Wildlife trafficking often, almost always, especially with the federal nexus, involves multiple states and often multiple countries. And so that need to be kind of grouped into a group of states, if you will, doesn't really that's it's not necessary for us. And so the reorganization, we've really just taken the old model and then restructured ourselves into major functional groups. So that way we're agile and we're able to address, any major issue at the time with a concentrated team of agents tackling, complex, wildlife crime issues. As far as our
Yes, I
strategies, our strategies really closely align with the administration's, and that rings true always. But when you look at kind of what's important right now, border security, public safety and health, the protection of domestic resources and the prevention of exploitation of those resources, those all ring true with our work in combating the wildlife trade, especially when you're introducing through smuggling efforts potentially invasive species or species that carry pathogens and other diseases that, when mishandled or not handled appropriately, or even detected, can prevent some issues or provide some issues for the public. And then again, the exploitation again of wildlife and plants. Um, that's a two-way street. We interdict shipments coming into the U.S. of illicit wildlife, and we also do the same thing for shipments going out. You know, a, a major, I guess, domestic species has always been turtles, for example. Um, so like I said, the strategies of us currently, they currently mirror that of the administrations, but also, I'd like to point to kind of the END Act, the Eliminate, Neutralize, and Disrupt Act, which addresses our efforts to combat wildlife trafficking by eliminating poaching at the source, neutralizing these networks that are engaged in wildlife trafficking, and disrupting illegal trade routes. And that really goes into, um, you know, our work collaboratively because, as I mentioned earlier, like wildlife trafficking and wildlife crime doesn't just happen in any one state or one country. It's a global issue, and that requires us all to work together. So those are our focuses, as well as those complex issues with the biggest impacts to the most imperiled species, I think has always been kind of what rings true as a priority for us.
Billy, I remember yesterday or the day before when we talked, you were mentioning that the reorganization will help to keep the organization leaner as well as focus on complex issues better and get rid of the geographic locations or boundaries and then have the efforts to join together. I also remember you mentioned something about a lot of the illegal proceeds coming from illegal wildlife trading. Actually, now are more intertwined with other illegal proceeds coming from other crimes or illegal activities. Do you mind double click a little bit on this topic and give some examples to the audience about these specific complex trading systems?
Sure. Um, as an example, we've investigated without getting into too much detail. We have criminal investigations in the past where um, you know illicit proceeds of other types of trafficking, like narcotics trafficking, have been intertwined with legitimate, wildlife or for specifically seafood business, um, to obfuscate the source of those funds. And so, the legal trade in wildlife has been used as a vehicle to hide proceeds from other crimes. Um, in other examples, we also have certain certain areas of the country, and specifically right now in the southern border of the U.S., where a lot of those trade routes, regardless of the commodity, whether it's wildlife or any other illicit good, are controlled by organized criminal elements like the cartels. And so, those are two examples specifically of how the wildlife trade is intertwined with other types of major crime.
Yeah, and that probably will lay a foundation for our discussion later, how to cooperate and collaborate with different organizations, private and public sectors, especially because of the nature of how everything is intertwined together. So, Billy, I would like to advance to the next topic about the specialty areas within the OLD. I know that we prepare some topics about bilateral investigations units, the investigative supports unit, as well as the wildlife inspectors. So if you're ready, we're going to jump into those topics.
Sure.
First one, maybe we can start with the bilateral investigation unit so that you can give the audience some background information on this one.
Sure. Yeah. So within OLE, along with our, our field special agents that conduct, criminal investigations, we do have some specialized units. Many of them operating underneath the division, the Special Operations Division, and the Bilateral Investigations Unit is one of them. And it's actually a merger in line with this reorg of two former units. So the unit that I came from, the Special Investigations Unit, and the International Operations Unit. And so basically, we're taking our major crimes unit, or what historically has been our major crimes unit for OLE, and blending it with the international unit, again, because wildlife trafficking doesn't operate in a bubble. So this allows us to achieve our capacity building mission and liaison mission overseas with our foreign partners through our regional attaches. And I believe we have 9 of them right now. I believe historically we've had 10, but I think we're closing off. So we have 9 regional attaches. They will continue representing the Department of Interior overseas and continue doing the capacity building out and outreach efforts to basically bolster up the capabilities of our partners in addressing the wildlife trade, um, while providing special agents to be on hand, in country as needed, but they're domestically based to conduct these, again, larger reaching complex criminal investigations. And so we're not taking away from our networking and our partnership capacity with the attaches. We're simply bolstering our capabilities overseas and domestically by combining these units.
Sounds great. And what about the other investigative units?
So the other support units at the headquarters or special operations level, our training and development unit includes inspectors and agents staffed at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Georgia, and they are responsible for um, not only building out the agency-specific training programs that typically take place after the basic training in either academy, but they also build upon existing training regimens, and they schedule yearly in-service training for our agents. They provide training on new and emerging techniques or technologies or issues, um, and they provide any other supportive training requests. So if we have um, a need that maybe the Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't provide, they can outsource that training for our agents and inspectors too.
Training
As
topics,
far
what
as
do you
the,
usually cover?
I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Training topics, what do you usually cover?
Well, after you get your basic either criminal investigative or inspection training, you need to know the laws that we enforce. And so a lot of that is nuanced into the federal wildlife laws that the OLE is responsible for enforcing. The bread and butter of a lot of what we do is undercover work. As you can imagine, like any other network, these wildlife trafficking and the networks that engage in it are close knit and they're tight communities, and there's a reason for that. It's, what they're doing is unlawful and they don't want to be detected. And so we found that not always, but a lot of times traditional law enforcement techniques just don't work, or they're just not effective in completely building out a case on an organization or an entity engaged in this activity. And so um, we've had a lot of success in the past conducting undercover work. And so to build upon those successes and ensure that our agents are safe and we're following the law and we're using techniques that will lead to uh, the highest possibility of success, we build upon kind of the initial basic training, and we conduct advanced undercover training as well. Um, Another area is interviewing techniques. Train advanced interviewing techniques. We'll train in um, any sort of like technical specialty that might be needed out in the field. So it's a pretty wide range of law enforcement training that we offer and provide.
Thank you, Billy. Please continue. I know you are going to talk about the other investigative
Yeah, sure.
unit support.
So just a couple others. The Wildlife Intelligence Unit, that's um, headquartered here with me in Virginia, comprises of intelligence research specialists that basically do a lot of deep dives into subjects of our investigation to determine relationships and patterns and possible indicators of leads for us to follow when we're looking into suspected wildlife crime. Um, they have a broad array of tools at their disposal. They're also partnered with some other federal agencies and organizations as well. And then we have our digital evidence and recovery and technical support unit. So it's comprised of basically two different functions. Um, any sort of digital forensic analysis that's needed pursuant to our investigations, whether it's a seized cell phone or a computer or anything that we need basically a technical dive into, they'll provide that support. And they're also responsible for providing other types of technical support. So I mentioned that we do a lot of undercover work. They're very good at fabricating microphones and audio recording devices and outfitting facilities with tools that we need to capture evidence while we're doing this type of work. So they're very skilled, and we appreciate them a lot. And more recently, we just established an unmanned aircraft system program or drones that our program coordinator for that program lies within the digital evidence recovery and technical support unit. So um, yeah, they're stationed in Jacksonville, and our agents in the field rely on them heavily for successes in our investigative work.
Thanks, Billy. Before I go to the next slide or next topic, I actually have one more question to follow up here. I remember back in May in the BAFT Global Annual Meeting, when talking with one of your colleagues, as well as for the United for Wildlife, there was a question or there's a discussion point coming up saying the typologies, the red flags of trade-based money laundering in illegal wildlife trafficking. We were having a conversation that the criminals are actually getting smarter and smarter. So that we also need to become smarter, not only to catch up with the speed, but also to outrace them. So I think that for other public sectors as well as the private sectors, including us like consultants, we are trying to always see what the new typologies are, what the new red flags are. I know we're going to touch it a little bit at the end on a higher level, but since we're talking about this conversation here, how does their OLE or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, when they provide training, how do they learn from these lessons learned or experience and continue to enhance and identify new typologies? Maybe your experience will be a good reference also for the audience on today's platform as well.
Yeah, I think for us, it's especially with some of the work that we do and the type of work that is. I think you have to understand that um, you can't be complacent. I've learned that in 17 years, there's always going to be something to learn, and there's always going to be a new angle. There's going to be a new technique um, that traffickers use to obfuscate their activities, and it's our job to, like you said, stay on top of that and evolve and emerge. And so part of that's being honest with yourself and, acknowledge like you're going to make mistakes, but own those mistakes and learn from them. So, um, we're always learning whether it's, a particular case or particular encounter, what works and what doesn't work, and then we'll build upon that and move forward. And then I think the other key to that is just the collaboration part, right? There's something that and we'll talk about this later. There's something that maybe the financial sector is seeing that we just don't have an expertise in, or we're not seeing, or there might be something that a foreign partner is seeing on their side of the country or the world related to this activity that we're not privy to, or there's a technique they're using. So it's just constant communication and always looking for areas to improve. I think that's kind of our our task and the way that we succeed is just just continuing to build upon the work that we do.
Yeah, the collaboration part is very important so that you
Yeah.
can exchange your knowledge and the most recent trends. Perfect. And the next one, Billy, would like you to talk a little bit about the wildlife inspectors. Per my understanding, they're the front office, right? They're the first line people.
Right. We call, yeah, that's exactly it. We call them the front lines. They are staffed at all major ports across the country. We call them designated ports for wildlife. There are 18 designated ports, so all wildlife entering or exiting the country must be declared through a designated port, absent a permit or an exemption permit that allows you to go somewhere else. So we have inspector staff at those ports and elsewhere. And yes, they regulate the legal wildlife trade, and they're also responsible for interdicting illegal wildlife. And so, speaking on the collaboration component earlier, there are things that we uncover in a criminal investigation that maybe because of the way that criminals have been hiding or bringing in wildlife into the country that maybe the inspection program is not privy to, then it's on us to share that with them. And then alternatively, they are always pretty good at working with these special agents and identifying new smuggling techniques or illicit activity that evolves into a criminal investigation.
Is this group of people also subject to the training program that you mentioned earlier? And they just probably diverse different types of training based on their roles and responsibilities in the organization?
Yeah, they go through similar they go through training. They go through a wildlife inspector basic school. Similar but different, right? Because our roles are slightly different. And so they do, like us, have a basic training, and then as they advance, they continue, you know, um, evolving, if you will, throughout their career.
Do you see people rotate in roles? If I may ask these questions, like for example, wildlife inspectors and later special agents, or the other way around, like just to see the full picture of everything?
We do. We actually have a pretty significant amount of special agents that used to be wildlife inspectors. And that's great because they have a working knowledge of the wildlife trade. They have a working knowledge of how the ports operate and, some of the nuance in customs and shipping rules and methods. And so that really does kind of support and provide value to, conducting a criminal investigation, having that background knowledge. We don't often see the reverse, but it's quite often that an inspector throughout their career might pursue a special agent position down the line.
Got it. And the next whole section is something very interesting, at least for me, because you're going to talk about the different unique elements of OLE. I almost call them unique programs. And they cover many different areas, like a forensic lab, the one and only one in the world, and in Portland, right? If I remember the location. Oregon, Portland,
Ashland. What's
Ashland.
that? Ashley, yeah, you're
And
right.
and the other ones that you have some examples of different programs for various types of animals as well as Indian arts. They have an act here. So whichever topic you want to go first, I'll go to that slide.
Sure, we can start with the lab.
Okay.
So, yeah, the Clark Babin National Fish and Wildlife Laboratory it's the only wildlife dedicated wildlife forensic laboratory of its kind. Um, and we use them quite frequently. As you can imagine, there are millions of species across the world. Some have additional protections and some do not. And so, and a lot of them are similar in appearance. So when we're conducting an investigation, a critical component is identifying properly what the wildlife is that we're dealing with, so we can say in a court of law, like, this is what we say it is. And so the lab goes on and provides species identification frequently for us, but also, like any other criminal investigative lab, they basically do similar work in connecting, the wildlife to a crime scene to a criminal, like anyone else would. And that, simply put, They conduct morphology. They can determine cause of death. They can do ballistics, what have you. And so they're very important to us, and they do very important work, not only for us, but they also support um, all of our state conservation law enforcement agencies when needed, and um, parties to the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species in Wild Flora and Fauna, or CITES, if you will. So very, very thankful for the lab. And one unique element to them in recent years is the establishment of a mobile forensics lab, which allows them to travel to a port or another place where we want to conduct a targeted operation, to quickly identify suspected illicit timber that isn't, imported or exported out of the country, with their mass spectrometry device. Um, and they're also able to conduct, analysis of potential false documentation on site too. So that's a capability that we've added in recent years. Another unit, I guess, or another unique element to us is the existence of our repositories. So we have the National Wildlife Repository and the National Eagle Repository, and so that's basically a clearinghouse, if you will, of seized and forfeited wildlife, um, that have either been abandoned by entities when um, violating the law, or we have seized it, and again, it's been subsequently forfeited to the U.S. government. And we use that wildlife in the repository for educational outreach purposes and sometimes other law enforcement purposes. But the Eagle Repository in particular serves a purpose through making available Eagle parts and products to federally recognized tribal members. That's a way to provide them with a source of eagle parts and both bald and golden eagles. And so um, we it's an important function of what we do. And then lastly, I think another, Jilene brought it up, is our Indian Arts and Crafts unit. So our Indian Arts and Crafts unit enforces the Indian Arts and Crafts Act, which is kind of a truth in marketing law that protects, um, the cultural, intellectual property of Native Americans in the country and their work, um, through targeting, entities and individuals that counterfeit uh, goods and mislabel them and falsely claim that they're Native American handicrafts. And so it's kind of a unique function. It doesn't necessarily fit in the fish and wildlife realm, but given the work that we do, and I mentioned the undercover work and some of the other criminal investigative work that we do, um, we are kind of nicely organized to conduct that type of work, and so we do. And our unit is very successful at uncovering those operations and you know taking them down. So
Just
those are
one.
some unique you know offices that are comprised under the OLE, in addition to our traditional enforcement investigative arms.
There's one more, right? The turtle ones. Would you like to talk a little bit more about it? Because I did hear about the turtle stories from different people.
Which one was that?
Is the Wildlife Inspection Program Homeland Impact?
Oh yeah, so yeah, in terms of like, I guess, um, I guess critical issues. Yes, the domestic exploitation of American turtle species is ever you know it's a major issue right now for us. Um, and our inspection program again is on the front line of identifying all the different mechanisms that they're smuggled out. It's not uncommon that they'll be exported out through the international mail stream, through our ports of wildlife or other major ports, and mislabeled as plastic toys or dog toys or whatever the case may be. They're smuggled in socks, smuggled in, various packaging. And so, yeah, it's, it's a problem. It's not uncommon for a middleman or distributor in the US to, pay poachers from all across the country to collect these things and then consolidate them and then ship them overseas. And so our inspection program is critical in identifying those new methods and techniques and passing them on to investigators as we're building out our criminal investigations.
Thank you, Billy. I'm going to take down the slides because I have a personal question for you. Is that after knowing what you have done in all these years and your roles and responsibilities, what drives you every day to do your job? Because most of us on this call, we sit in the office, sometimes day in and day out. We want to know the meaning of our role and our job. I think you may be able to give us some inspiration before we roll to some higher level questions for the audience.
Yeah, the problem. So the question is what drives me to do my job.
Yeah.
I've always been drawn to law enforcement, and that the philosophical desire to do something good for the my fellow person. I love the outdoors. I love being in nature, and so I love the ability to enjoy the wildlife that is around us and across the world. And I think crime is crime, and whether it involves wildlife or any other commodity, it's pretty. It's I like the challenge of uncovering what seems to be a puzzle at the time, at the beginning, and kind of unraveling that, and you know, again for the benefit of everyone else in the world. So that's what drives me, and I just I think personally I'm very aware that there's always something to learn, and so in this job you have to have that mindset is that you have to continue to grow and evolve, and that in and of itself drives me as well.
Perfect. I think that solving the puzzles and always do the investigations and thinking and learning parts, I'm sure that a lot of us share these traits here. That's why we sit in this call, and that's why we are in the anti-financial crime field. Um, Next question. What do you consider as the top challenges in prevention and detection of the trade-based money laundering in illegal wildlife trading?
I think a big challenge is just the complexity of it all, of trade in and of itself. I mean, there's so much areas I think that can be manipulated, right? Whether it's an invoice or a label or kind of blending proceeds with different commodities. That in and of itself is inherently difficult. I think also just naturally, not by design, there is a lack of coordination sometimes from different entities or sectors. Like I'm looking at things from a law enforcement perspective, and maybe you see something differently, but naturally we're just, there's a barrier there, and so I think sometimes coordination could be an issue as well, um, in terms of like seeing the complete picture. So I think integrated systems or a way of sharing that information would make that maybe a little more easier, but it's certainly an interesting conundrum.
Yeah, I want to stay with the coordination parts on both the private side and the public side. So how can our private sector, such as the financial institutions, help to assist in the combating of illegal wildlife? I know you mentioned a few really great points that a lot of us actually are very familiar with the different programs like KYC and transaction monitoring. But would you mind giving us a little bit more insights about how the private sector can help?
Yeah, I mean, and we talked about it earlier. So, all criminals need money to finance their activities, and that's no different with wildlife. And so, as these proceeds, especially with these larger cases, move through the financial system, the financial sector has done a very good job in implementing, um, mechanisms or auditing tools or other ways to detect suspected illicit activity. And a lot of times it's, things that might reveal ownership or connections that we're not privy to. And so, certainly financial institutions, they can help identify that type of suspicious activity, especially if they suspect that it involves wildlife. Um, Due diligence is also a key in this, is knowing who your customers are, knowing the businesses that they're engaged in, and then maybe identifying any red flags, whether it's a focus country where wildlife trafficking is prominent, or in conjunction with any other types of intelligence that is out there with the illegal wildlife trade, and then just figuring out a way to communicate when those flags are uncovered.
May I summarize in a few points? It's almost like a takeaways for this group is like have a very well established KYC program to know your high risk customers and make sure that the transaction monitoring part is also good to keep an eye on the red flags typologies. And we talked about it earlier that's continue to enhance the typologies and how you can catch up. Sometimes I'll use the word catch up because criminals do run fast
Yes,
um,
they do.
of
Yeah,
the
we're
activities.
very reactive and a lot of what we do sometimes, unfortunately, but that's just the way that it works.
Yeah, yeah. It's like a game. Who is better? And it just keeps evolving. And the last part you also mentioned, but I want to use some of the terminologies that we always use in the banking system, is that the world is that communicate with the law enforcement, right? If identifying something, some special patterns, suspicious patterns, make the communications be transparent, provide you guys with the information so that you can connect the dots, what you can see and what we can see, so that you can see a full picture. So I'm thinking about those three areas based on what the private sectors can help.
Yeah, and a lot of times, yeah, you're absolutely right. A lot of times when that activity is uncovered too, I can understand probably from the financial institution's perspective that they want to mitigate the risk, and if they detect things like that, like suspected unlawful trade activity, they might be prone to um, separate themselves or close off the account or otherwise, take some similar action. Um, but if they're coordinating with us, sometimes it does help to work together and maybe, figure out if we can build out that network and maybe collect some additional evidence before doing so. But I think that's where the communication and collaboration comes in.
Perfect. And the last question I have for you, also collaboration, but with the public sector. Last time we had a guest speaker for the United for Wildlife as well. I think that will be one of the example. What are the other public sector, public organizations that you also collaborate with to again gain this full picture of everything?
Right, United for Wildlife is huge because they've managed to create specific sectors specialization that certainly touch the wildlife trade with the transport sector and the financial sector. There are a host of conservancy organizations out there that specialize in a particular geographic area or a specific species or what have you. Um, that you can be a part of and tied into, as well as like other non-governmental organizations that are dedicated to wildlife conservation.
That's perfect. We are 2 minutes before our section ends. I want to open to the floor for any questions that you may have. You can type it in the Q&A function or just raise your hand. I'll give it 15 more seconds. Awesome. I think we are good. Feel free, as Miriam mentioned earlier at the beginning of this workshop, if you have any questions that you come up with later after today's section, just feel free to email us. We are happy to answer them. And Billy, thank you so much for joining us today. And it's very nice working with you again. It's always a pleasure. So thank you for joining and sharing your story and perspectives.
Likewise, thank you, Jailene, and thank you everyone for having me.
Thank you.